get started. My name is Todd Smith, and I'm the new Executive Director of the Beckler Museum of Modern Art, and it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce tonight's Cocktails and Conversation. Again, we'd ask that if you've just joined us, to please go ahead and mute your screen so that we don't have any interruptions when our two guests start to have a conversation. So it's a real pleasure to have all of you joining us tonight. I know we're having a really robust crowd, and we look forward to your questions and your comments. If you have them, please put them in the chat box as the evening goes on, and our moderator will review those and read the ones at the end that seem to catch his attention. Hopefully they'll be the ones that you submitted. But again, it's a real pleasure to have our curator, Anastasia James, and Eric Shiner, our guest tonight, in this Cocktails and Conversation. This is the fourth one the museum has hosted online, and they've proven to be very successful and very informative. So I know tonight will be part of that lineup as well. So tonight we're coming together to talk about a brand new exhibition that the museum will open next Friday when we reopen to the public after over 6 months of being closed. So again, if you have not heard, we are reopening next weekend. For those of you who are members, thank you for your support. It's always free for you. For those of you who are not yet members of the museum, we are free admission next weekend, thanks to the generosity of Bank of America. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Anastasia James.
Thank you, Todd, and welcome to the Beckler. I believe it's your end of your second week here. So
second full week, yes.
Well, thank you, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth virtual Cocktails and Conversations that we have hosted here at the Beckler. Many of you joined us for our first Cocktails and Conversation, where we discussed the history of the collection, followed by conversations with Bob and Ziad about our jazz program, all of which were truly fascinating. Tonight, I will be in conversation with Eric Shiner, Executive Director of Pioneer Works and former Director of the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, where we first met many years ago. Tonight's conversation is in conjunction with our next upcoming exhibition on the subject of the landmark print portfolio, One Cent Life, which was created by the Chinese-American poet and painter Wallace Ting. Ting is often overlooked and has received very little critical attention in the past few decades, especially with regard to his contributions to the medium of printmaking. Together with Eric, I will discuss Ting, his biography, and a selection of works from the portfolio that will be on view beginning next Friday, including works by such luminary artists as Joan Mitchell, Andy Warhol, and Robert Indiana. But first, I would like to offer a warm Beckler welcome to Eric Shiner, a brilliant scholar and someone I am lucky to call both a friend and a mentor. And I welcome Eric to make a few remarks about his own trajectory in the arts and what his areas of expertise are.
Well, Anastasia and Todd also, thank you so much for having me here this evening, and thank all of you for tuning in tonight. I am so happy to do this, and Anastasia has been a constant in my life for a long time, and I'm just so thrilled to see you blossom in your career and doing the amazing work that you're doing. So huge congratulations to you also being a fairly new addition to the Beckler Museum, which I had the pleasure of visiting many moons ago on a trip to Charlotte, where my sister happens to live. So there's a little bit of a connection there. Were I to talk about my trajectory in the art world, it would take 4 hours. So basically, I started off studying medieval Japanese art history at the University of Pittsburgh, focusing on 16th century Japanese castle architecture. Needless to say, I had no career hopes whatsoever in that field. And luckily for me, upon graduating from college in the spring of 1994 in Pittsburgh, I was very fortunate to be asked to be the first curatorial intern at the brand new Andy Warhol Museum, which opened on May 13th, 1994. I started working at the museum that week and completely dove into Andy Warhol and everything about him. I then decided to, and go Steelers, exactly, boom. So I hope there's a Steelers bar in Charlotte, I'm sure there is. So at any rate, I decided to marry my two loves, Warhol and things contemporary in Japan, and decided to look at Japanese contemporary art. So I ended up moving to Japan. I lived there for 6 years, did my first master's degree in post-war Japanese art at Osaka University, became a curator at the first ever Yokohama Triennale in 2001, and then found my way back to the States, where I started my graduate studies at Yale, also in post-war Japanese art. And shockingly, after many years in convolutions and living in New York as an independent curator for years, I got a call one day to come back to Pittsburgh to be the chief curator of the Andy Warhol Museum in 2008. So I went back home, served in that role for 2 years, and our then director decided to retire. And I was asked if I would be acting director and then also director of the museum, a role that I served in for 6 years until 2016. So I had some forays in the commercial art world at Sotheby's and at White Cube Gallery in the years after that. And just earlier this year, decided to take on the great challenge of taking Pioneer Works, a wonderful nonprofit in Red Hook, Brooklyn, to the next level. And the first 8 weeks were going incredibly well. And then all of a sudden, COVID happened. But we've been doing incredible work, not only in our community, serving our neighbors in Red Hook through food distribution, tech support, and other things, and also beaming our message out to the world on our broadcasts. And I hope people can tune in. So it's really thrilling to be here tonight, and also to talk about this portfolio, which is incredibly cool.
Well, thank you, Eric. So I guess we will just jump into it. I think a lot of you are probably wondering, who is this Wallace Ting that I've said his name quite a few times. And I hope that by the end of tonight's program that you have a better idea of who he was and what his contributions to art history were. He was born Ding Shun Quan in Shanghai in 1929, just at the very tail end of what was considered Shanghai's golden age. But when he was 3, the Japanese forces invaded the city, and around 18,000 civilians were either killed or declared missing. And so he grew up under the Japanese occupation in Shanghai. And as soon as the war was over, when he was 17, he fled to Hong Kong, where he lived for 6 years, before eventually taking a boat to Paris, where he lived among a very interesting group of artists. And this first slide kind of just gives you a sense of what he looked like then, next to the dust jacket for the portfolio of 1 Cent Life. But diving right into it, Eric, you have anything to add about his childhood?
Well, I mean, we know that he lived in pretty extreme poverty, and you can only imagine what living in occupied territory would be like, and just thinking that he had the grit and the determination to find his way out and make his way to Hong Kong and then eventually to Paris, just I think shows his determination in making sure that his aesthetics and his vision saw a broader and global audience. And he's certainly a prime example of globalism writ large.
Mm-hmm. And while he began living as an artist in Hong Kong, he wasn't really showing professionally. He had a few small exhibitions in bookstores in Hong Kong, but it wasn't until he arrived in Paris that he really blossomed as an artist.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that I'm sure many people know Kusama Yayoi, the Japanese artist, who was also born the same year in 1929. And also, just for context, Andy Warhol was born in 1928, just the year before. So they're all on the same timeline.
Mm-hmm. So diving into Paris, which is kind of interesting. The story is in 1952, he got on a boat with $5 in his pocket and left for Paris, which is kind of just an amazing thing to think of him doing at such a young age. A reminder, if you're coming in a little bit late, to please mute your accounts.
As we can hear you.
We can.
He may have been lying, by the way, about the $5 in the pocket, because he did tend to be a boastful type of person.
Yes, and he loved to elaborate on his biography, as you will see in some later slides. Upon his arrival, he started going to the museums and galleries and starting to meet people, and he discovered the work of Henri Matisse. And the story goes is that that's when he decided to change his name, tacking on SSE, an emulation of Matisse, becoming Wallace Ting. And that's really who he became known as for the remainder of his life. And as I'm sure many of you know, Paris for the first half of the 20th century was home to the most dynamic art scene in the world, due in no small part to the influx of immigrant artists who radically changed the history of art. And while we celebrate those such as Picasso and Chagall and Miro and Modigliani, less attention has been paid to the Chinese artists who also made Paris their home in the interwar and post-World War II years. Artists such as San Yu in the 1930s were established members of the Parisian art scene. Really a truly interesting artist if you're not familiar with him. He was trained in classical Chinese painting and calligraphy, and he became a fixture of the cafes and salons in the 30s and 40s. He was friends with people like Fernand Léger and Modigliani. His work often blended the Parisian avant-garde traditions with the core concepts of Chinese painting. And this is all to say that there were Chinese immigrants living and working and finding great success in Paris beginning in the 1930s, which is a really interesting thing to think about contextually. If Eric, you want to chime in about any of this? This is perhaps the most important Chinese contemporary artist of the 20th century who arrived in Paris in 1948. He lived very close to Giacometti's studio, and he is considered part of the École de Paris, the School of Paris, like many of the artists that we have in the Beckler's collection.
Exactly, and Zhao Wuqi today is one of the most sought after Chinese artists in the world, and not only are international collectors super interested in the work, but even more so mainland Chinese collectors. So his canvases, oftentimes sadly, that were sitting in storage in the great museums of the world, very rarely seeing the light of day, are now coming to market as museums realize they have 2 or 3 and decide to maybe sell one. And a single canvas can easily sell in the $2 to $6 million range, and certainly beyond that as well. His work is just absolutely lyrical and, so influenced by calligraphy and things Taoist in many ways, very ethereal, but also very infused with the language and vocabulary of abstract expressionism, which certainly is relevant to Ting as well.
Mm-hmm. And the final example of an artist who was living in Paris in the post-war years is Zhu Techun, also a very successful artist in his time. He was actually the first Chinese member of the Académie des Beaux-Arts. He moved to Paris in 1955, so around the same time that Wallace Ting was there. And why I included him was because he was deeply influenced by Nicolas de Staël, who we have a fabulous painting by in the Beckler collection. So just kind of thinking how there were connections between some of the European artists and these Chinese artists. And while there's no evidence that Ting was close friends with these artists, he would have certainly known about them. And it may have been the reason why he went to Paris, because he saw that there were Chinese artists having successful careers in this wonderful city. And he would have known about this because these 3 artists in particular did travel between Hong Kong and Paris throughout their lives.
And, it's interesting to note that there were many Japanese artists in Paris in the 1950s as well, especially Jiro Yoshimoto and, many of the Gutai artists who were there in dialogue with Tapier especially. And they oftentimes would just spend a few years in Paris and then go back to Japan, taking their newfound ammunition in terms of making art back to Japan and radically changing what would become known as contemporary art in Japan.
Mm-hmm. And of a fascinating history that's not often spoken about.
It's one of those inconveniences of art history which tends to want to put people in their lane, whether that be European or Asian, and we have to realize the intercultural dialogue that has been happening for a very long time and how important it is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What we do know is that when Ting arrived in 1952, he very quickly went about making new friends. And many of the friends he met, who would become lifelong collaborators with him, were the founding members of the Cobra Group, including Karel Appel, Pierre Alechinsky, and Asger Jorn. And they would be deeply, deeply influential on his aesthetic. The Cobra Group was a highly influential and anti-theoretical artist collective whose work was influenced by the art of children, but also individuals with intellectual disabilities. And Ting was really associated with them when he moved to Paris in the 1950s and continued to be associated with them throughout his career. Many of the artists he met during this time period are included in the One Cent Life portfolio. In 1954, Ting had his first show in Paris at Studio Paul Pichetti, which was a gallery that also showed the work of Jackson Pollock during this time period. And what you see on the left is a poster for his very first exhibition there, and a photo of him in the exhibition. His work was kind of very traditional when he moved to Paris at first, but very quickly we saw him begin to experiment with his painting. And here are 3 works, all from kind of roughly the same time period in Paris, all demonstrating kind of radically different approaches to art making. You obviously see the influence of Appel, but you also see, the influence of calligraphy and European modernism. Kind of a fascinating period of time when he really began to experiment with what he was doing. Any favorites, Eric?
I'm having to love that red figure on the right.
It's pretty great.
Yes, looks like a rather demented cat. It's great.
And so he began to show after that first exhibition. He had major exhibitions in Belgium and also again in Paris, and he was selling his work. And he finally raised enough money that he could buy a ticket to go to New York City, which he did in December of 1956. He arrived in Manhattan on January 8th, 1957, and I managed to find the original list from the ship that he was on, where you can see his name here listed as Hung T. Ting, which is one of the names that he went by during this time period. This was the SS Liberty arriving in New York City, and this is an actual photo of the boat he was on arriving in New York City in January of 1957, which is kind of amazing.
And I think we should probably say at this point that artists were coming to New York from all over the world, because there was also a very big shift happening at this very moment, where hitherto Paris had been the international art capital. It's where all of the movers and shakers wanted to be, but that started to shift in the post-war period, and throughout the course of the 1950s, New York was becoming more and more relevant. So by the latter part of the 1950s, New York all of a sudden defeated Paris and was the place to be. So this exodus is very real, and Ting was definitely part of it.
Absolutely. And this is a photo that was taken of him shortly after he arrived in New York City, where he rented a very small one-room studio near Times Square before settling into a larger studio on Broadway. This is a photo of him in his first studio very shortly after he arrived in New York. It's just a fabulous photo of him covered in paint with all of his painting material surrounding him.
Yeah, pretty big. Crazy, right?
So another part of the exhibition is providing a context that shows the audience that One Cent Life did not happen in a vacuum. Ting began making artist books that combined poetry and his paintings very early on. This was actually the first artist book that he published. The poetry that was written for it was completed in 1958, and it was published in 1961 for a gallery in Brussels. This is a original lithographed cover with a listing of the works that were included in the catalog. And to kind of give you an idea of what the interior looked like of this first artist book that he made. Another amazing fact about this book is that it was typeset and printed by Maurice Beaudet and George Girard, who would 2 years later also print and typeset 1 Cent Life. And so he had a relationship with this printer in France before he approached them to create 1 Cent Life.
And I think it's so important to think about the relationship between image and text, which in a Western perspective is often quite rare. Text is usually historically kept outside of the picture frame. Whereas in an Eastern tradition, in Chinese and Japanese art, text is part and parcel of the work of art in and of itself. We've all seen both Chinese and Japanese scrolls with either landscape paintings or images of animals, for example, with either relevant information about the artist and the title, or sometimes a poem included, or narrative about the goings on of the scene. So in many ways, this is just something that is part of Ting's growing up in terms of aesthetics, but he fully makes it contemporary and takes it to a different place. And I think that it's important that we make note of that.
Mm-hmm. And identifying him as a poet painter is very intentional nod to that and to the history of Chinese art history and culture. This particular book contained 20 pages, 10 poems, and black and white reproductions, in addition to 2 original color lithographs made specifically for the portfolio. Just kind of see him testing out the ideas that he would further develop a few years later.
We have a question asking if all of the books are typeset in English.
Yes, they are. There are Chinese characters and Chinese seals kind of sprinkled throughout most of his publications.
Yeah, but all of them have English text.
And he wrote all of his poetry in English. It's something that's very fascinating about his career. English was a language that he preferred to communicate in. And Eric and I were talking yesterday about that, about how being among an expat community in Paris, English was probably the common language that they all spoke with each other.
Yeah, decidedly.
Following the 1961 catalog, he soon created a catalog for an exhibition in Copenhagen, another example of how he was further developing his ideas of creating these print portfolios with poetry and lithographs. And you see here how he's starting to really experiment with typography in interesting ways with the large font. This is from 1963. Here you see a list of kind of his early exhibitions after that initial exhibition in 1954. Notably, you see in 1960, he had a solo exhibition at Martha Jackson Gallery in New York City, which would have been really significant for him at the time.
And also a major gallery.
Major gallery. And this is the poster for that exhibition, along with a list of some of the museums that held his work in their collections in 1963. And now his works can be found in museums kind of all over the world. Which kind of brings us to 1 Cent Life, the real focus of the exhibition. As the story goes, Wallace Ting wrote a series of 61 poems in 1961 while living in a tiny Manhattan studio. Soon after their completion, he had a dream to create a print portfolio where he would invite a group of artists, his friends in both Europe and the United States, to contribute color lithography in response to the poetry that he had written. He really wanted to capture the zeitgeist of this creative community caught between European abstraction and American pop art, very particular moment in time. And he specifically was drawn to the artist who, like him, bridged both the European and American avant-garde movements. What you see on the right again is the dust jacket for the portfolio, featuring an image of him that is hand-colored. And the cover was actually designed by Karel Appel's wife, Machteld Appel, who was a model for Balenciaga in Paris. Really fascinating woman and muse to Appel and many artists. And what you see on the left is a little snippet of an article that Ting penned for Art News in 1966, where he talks about approaching E.W. Kornfeld, the publisher, with Sam Francis. And they said, we're not angels, but we're going to publish the book even if we go to jail. So it felt like they were being kind of really renegade with this project. And he also talks about how it was behind schedule and it was way over budget, and Sam Francis had to go to Switzerland to pull money out of his bank to buy the paper. It's kind of just a little funny insight into how the portfolio is actually made. But it also is the words of the portfolio's creator talking about how it was really his idea and his aesthetic vision, not Sam Francis, who acted as the editor, or anyone else. And here are some examples of some of the poetry that you'll find in the portfolio. There are 61 poems within the portfolio in addition to all of the color lithographs. Some of the lithographs are paired with poetry and some of them are not. Some of the poetry is kind of standalone like you see here. And you really kind of start to get a sense of how Ting phrased his words and how he evoked imagery through very simple descriptions. And these are just kind of two examples of really beautiful poetry that you find within its pages.
Yeah, not only is it great in terms of its actual language, but the graphic design is incredibly intriguing as well.
Absolutely. And a lot of his poems, they reference both the tone and metrical patterns of not only classical Chinese poetry, but the rhythm of American beat prose and poetry and jazz music and the urban environment as he was experiencing it. You can almost picture this recent immigrant like walking around Manhattan. He talks about the restaurants he went to, the people he met, the things he was eating. It's kind of a really wonderful stream of consciousness book of poetry. Here are an example of some of the interior pages that you will see in the exhibition. There are 18 framed prints in the exhibition, in addition to a large number of material that would be present in cases on the second floor. Trying to give you an idea of what some of these pages looked like, and we'll do a deep dive into a few specifics. The first one I want to draw your attention to is a print by Pierre Alechinsky, who was known for his distinctive, brightly colored paintings. He was a Belgian artist and one of the founding members of Cobra that I mentioned. Really think this is beautiful. Wallace Ting wrote in a short bit of poetry that when Alechinsky was making this print, he was pressing blue ghosts down into the paper. And it really changed the way that I looked at it, because you see these kind of wispy blue moments throughout the image. And it is paired with a poem that Ting wrote for Alechinsky, kind of very personal poem to him. Kind of really lovely pairing of poetry and imagery.
And is it true that Ting would take the paper with the poem written out and then ask the artist to do the work on top of that?
He would. He actually personally went to most of the studios of the artists he invited with the printing plates, crayons, whatever materials they would need, and he'd spread out the poetry on the floor and say, pick one. And they would have the option to choose which poem of the 61 that he had written to respond to. And you have to think about color lithography in 1962, 1963. It was kind of a radical medium. Brand new. I mean, commercial printing was using color lithography, but fine artists were not. They were just beginning to experiment with black and white lithography at places like Tamarind. Yep. So using color lithography like this was really innovative. And it was also, for many of the artists in the portfolio, the first time that they were working with this specific medium. Mm. I included Alechinsky for a variety of reasons, one being that he and Ting had an extremely close relationship for their entire lives. They often collaborated on prints, as you see in the upper left-hand corner. This is a print in the collection of MoMA in New York. On the right, you see a picture of them at a print workshop, kind of working together on something. And I also wanted to tell you how Alechinsky hired Ting to teach him calligraphy when Ting first moved to Paris. And Alechinsky actually became the French correspondent for the Japanese magazine Bokubi, which was a very influential post-war magazine, particularly for artists in New York.
Absolutely.
This happens to be one of Eric's favorite prints in the portfolio. I don't know if you want to introduce it.
Well, it's by Joan Mitchell, and I have to admit that I was very fortunate to just be able to buy this myself on an online auction. And I am obviously in the art world, in the nonprofit art world, so I'm not a rich man. I was able to buy this for $125, which I was blown away by. And I will tell you, it will be the only Joan Mitchell I will ever own. But I was so thrilled to be able to acquire this. And of course, Joan Mitchell, who is one of the most important artists of the 20th century period, who as a woman artist, of course, had to deal with the realities of being a woman artist in the 1950s and take, sadly and incorrectly, a backseat to the male abstract expressionist. But Joan is certainly proving victorious, as she is one of the most sought after artists on the commercial art market today. I think we should probably remind everyone tuning in that you can still find bargains in the art world, and prints from the 1 Cent Life portfolio tend to sell from, $100 up to normally $400 to $800, depending on the artist, and certainly a few thousand for the big names like Andy Warhol.
And oftentimes, as Eric mentioned, this portfolio is split up and the prints are sold individually because many of these artists have become so sought after. And at the Beckler, we are so lucky to have a complete portfolio. And not only a complete portfolio, but one of the special editions that is actually signed by all of the artists. It's actually one of 60 that were available to the public. So we have a really, really kind of precious object at the museum that we're so lucky to have.
Exactly, and those are much rarer. The open edition for the series was 2,000 editions, and if you wanted to buy a full complete set, that would be somewhere in the $6,000 to $10,000 range to buy the entire portfolio intact. But they are quite rare because most of them have been split up. And one other thing about this Joan Mitchell image specifically, it's one of the only, there are just a few in the portfolio that don't have poems or text involved or attached.
And for those of you that are fans of Joan Mitchell's work, the years 1960 to 1964 were really pivotal in her career. It's when she started moving towards these dark central masses. And she herself described her work from this period as being very violent and angry. Maybe some of you know this, maybe you don't. She was in a very tumultuous relationship, many-year tumultuous relationship with the artist Jean-Paul Riopelle, who you see here on the upper right with one of his paintings in the background. As many of you are aware, we have a gorgeous Riopelle painting currently on view on the 4th floor of the museum. But they kept separate studios near each other in France. And I believe they were together for about 27 years before finally calling it off. But it was a very rocky relationship. And probably one of the reasons why her paintings became very dark during this period. On the bottom right, you can kind of see that dark central mass that I was talking about as she developed it in painting as well as printmaking.
Yeah. And tumultuous is an understatement. They were definitely in the throw bottles at each other kind of relationship.
Yeah. He was called the Wild Canadian in Paris. But I digress. One of the perhaps the most well-known print out of the portfolio, and really how I was even aware of the portfolio, was because of this print by Andy Warhol titled "I Love Your Kiss Forever Forever," paired with Wallace Ting's poem Jade White Butterfly. This is actually the first published and editioned print, I know that's a long description, by Andy Warhol, basically meaning it's a very important early work on paper by the artist. What's interesting about this print is that he decided to adapt it from a painting that he had made in 1962 of Marilyn's Lips, which is just a really gorgeous painting, one of my favorites.
And definitely one of my favorites as well. If any of you are in Washington, D.C., you can visit this painting at the Hirshhorn Museum. It's in the permanent collection there. We were once fortunately able to borrow it from the Hirshhorn and bring it to Pittsburgh for an exhibition. And it's just so absolutely strange and almost bordering on macabre in ways, and that Andy decides to just focus in on Marilyn's smile. And I don't need to tell you all that Marilyn Monroe was the biggest starlet of the age, the biggest icon. And Andy was head over heels infatuated and in love with her. And in so many ways emulated her and really wanted to rise to the same levels of fame in a lot of ways. And that was one of his driving forces, to be world famous. And when you think about a young gay boy from Pittsburgh who lives his life and his dreams through the Hollywood silver screen, in his youth, in the 1930s, as he grows up, all of a sudden Marilyn Monroe comes onto the scene, and he's just absolutely blown away by her. We actually don't think they ever met in real life, but Andy was amassing a huge collection of photographs of Marilyn. He oftentimes would check out images of Marilyn from her press photos for any of her films from the New York Public Library and never return them. The Warhol Museum has dozens and dozens of images that have the New York Public Library stamped on the back. So the overdue fees, I'm assuming, are quite large by this point. But he knew that she was going to be an icon that would be with us forever. And as soon as she died, and of course the circumstances of her death are still a mystery in many ways, he set about within just a week or two taking those photographs that he'd been collecting for years and utilizing them to create the paintings that we now view as some of the most important work of all time. This specific image is from a film, well, not a film still, a promotional still from the film Niagara. And he decides to just, in this work, hone in on her lips. And of course, that hints at the lips' sensuality, the power of language. I love that it's paired with text here. It's almost as though the mouths are speaking the language, and making them multicolored as he does here brings a true period pop aesthetic to the work.
Mm-hmm. It's a really gorgeous print and truly stunning in person. So I look forward to welcoming you to the museum to see it. And as Eric mentioned, it was in 1962 that he made his very first paintings of Marilyn. So very, very early on in his career. Warhol wasn't really the pop Warhol who we now know during this period of time. He'd first moved to New York in 1949 and had a successful career as a commercial illustrator, which I'm sure many of you know. But it wasn't until the late 1950s that he really started exhibiting his work. Here's a photo of Warhol in 1964 taken by the photographer William John Kennedy to kind of give you an idea. He wasn't quite so slick yet. I mean, he's in a kind of frumpy cardigan, actually in a field of flowers out in Queens. So this was kind of Warhol on the cusp of becoming the king of pop. It was also, 1964 was also the same year that he was commissioned to create a mural for the New York State Pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair. It was the year that he had his shows at the Stable Gallery, his Brillo box shows, kind of a really, really important year for Andy Warhol.
Yeah, and really the defining year in so many ways, because when you think that the soup cans, which of course we don't need to talk about because everyone knows the soup cans, but they premiered in the summer of 1962 at the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles and really sent shockwaves through the art world of the time. So Andy went from nearly a complete unknown in terms of name, even though everyone at least would have recognized his commercial illustrations, to from 1962 summer through 1964, in just 2 years, rising up to be probably the most talked about artist in the world, which is completely unparalleled. There's nothing like it. And soon thereafter, he had his first mid-career retrospective at the ICA in Philadelphia, which was then one of the most important contemporary art museums in the world. And to think that you have your first mid-career retrospective only 2.5 years after your very first show is absolutely incredible.
Truly. And here's another photograph of him from 1964 by Bruce Davidson with Robert Indiana sitting on the famous couch and his two little kitties. Their names are Ruby and Lacey. They were soon sent off to an orphanage, I believe in North Carolina. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe their kinfolk are still running around.
They might be. They were putting paw prints all over the works of art. So
yeah, that was bad.
It's bad.
But it's so great to see the studio, and you know, him and Indiana were then quite close, and to see the Most Wanted Men on the wall, and also those circular images up above leaning on them are tondos that most likely were probably Gold Marylands, I'm assuming, or any of the other celebrities that he was doing in circular forms. But, you know, just thinking about the 1964 World's Fair, Andy decided he would, when commissioned to do that mural that Anastasia just spoke about, decided to show the 13 most wanted men from the New York City police files from just, what, a year or two before that,
1960.
and do them in a huge 20-foot by 20-foot grid mural on the facade of the New York State Pavilion. Needless to say, Governor Rockefeller and other organizers of the fair were not happy and had it painted out in silver paint within 48 hours. They didn't want to welcome the world to New York through its most wanted felons.
Yeah. It's a wonderful story. Maybe we'll do a talk about that sometime. I co-curated an exhibition at the Queens Museum about the Most Wanted Men a few years ago. It's really fascinating.
Was so much fun, and you and Larissa did such a great job, and it then came to Pittsburgh.
It did. But I introduced that photo just to say Robert Indiana is also an artist included in the portfolio. Many of you may be familiar with him. He was associated with the pop art movement. He renamed himself Indiana after where he was born. This is kind of a really early print by Indiana. He started out as a sign painter, a union sign painter, working on all the giant billboards in Times Square for a major company in New York City. But after one of his friends died suddenly from falling off of the scaffolding, he decided to quit his job and become an artist. He had very recently, in the early 1960s, he had met Ellsworth Kelly, who had talked him into kind of moving into this area in Lower Manhattan called Kenty Slip. Here we have an image, and you can see Agnes Martin in the background with Ellsworth Kelly and Robert Indiana on their bikes in Lower Manhattan in the early 1960s. And I'm sure many of you are aware of the Love sculpture because it's one of his most well-known works, if not one of the most well-known works. Public artworks in the world. But many people don't know that it was based off of a drawing that he included in kind of a love letter, a poem written to Ellsworth Kelly, who was his lover during this time period. Yeah, fun little fact.
Yeah, which now isn't so radical, but then would have been incredibly radical. And also, if you jump back to the print, you literally see the vestiges of commercial work in that he's utilizing the concept of the stencil in depicting these forms and letters.
Mm-hmm. And if you look, maybe you can't see it, but if you look, there is the word love in this poem. And I like to believe that that's why he chose to respond to this particular poem, which reads, "Take good care of self, long journey ahead, keep strength, good ideas, love in heart, hatred bury in deep earth, spread self like giant to four winds." It's kind of a really beautiful image that Ting is painting, and he has chosen to pair with these beautiful stencils.
Yeah, and we need those words today more than ever.
We do. And finally, the last artist I want to tell you about is Claes Oldenburg. This is a print that he contributed to the portfolio. He was well known by 1963, 1964. He had created his store in Lower Manhattan, where he created kind of a robust body of work depicting things made out of plaster, chicken wire framework covered with paint and canvas, objects like food, things that you might typically buy in a store. And he also began making his soft sculptures with his wife, Patty Muka, who actually sewed all of these sculptures. This is one of his most well-known works from that period, from 1962, titled Cake. And if we go back to the print in the portfolio, we obviously see the reference to that soft sculpture in this drawing. And perhaps a portrait of his wife, Patty Muka, here on the left.
Yeah, definitely. And do you know where they got the idea for soft sculpture?
Why don't you tell them?
A little bit of art world gossip. Kusama Yayoi swears up and down that the two of them stole the idea of soft sculpture from her. Because of course she had been making her accumulation objects and covering furniture and other objects with sort of phallic soft sculptures. And the two of, well, actually all of them were in a group show that summer in New York. And Kusama was supposed to have a solo show that September. And if any of you know anything about Kusama Yayoi, sadly, mental issues are a very big part of her narrative and her biography. And she had a mental break. So she wasn't able to finish the work for the show. And lo and behold, the gallery gave the slot to the Oldenburgs, who made the premiere show of their soft sculptures. And to this day, Kusama swears they stole that idea from her. I don't know if that's fully true or not, but they at least knew about what she was doing.
I think it's a great little tidbit. I love those. That kind of brings us to the end of the prints I'm highlighting. Very quickly, I just wanted to also touch upon the fact that books continued to be, creating books and artist books continued to be a huge part of Wallace Ting's life after 1 Cent Life. This is an example of an artist book from 1967 titled Chinese Moonlight, where Ting translated 63 poems by 33 Chinese poets and interspersed them with his own color lithography. It's such a gorgeous, gorgeous work of art, which will be also on view in the exhibition. And here's an example of some of the poetry he translated in his typical fashion. Not a book that is very well known at all, but a very critical book, kind of in the cultural history, to think that he was translating these poets as early as 1967. And then another book that he created in 1969 called Hot and Sour Soup, which is really just fun, bright, pop art oriented book. Here are some of the spreads from that book where you can see him really starting to experiment even further with typography and colors.
I just love this, and it reads in a lot of ways like Sister Corita Kent, if anyone's familiar with her activist work that involves image and language. She was a nun from Los Angeles who was a great social justice activist in the 1960s and beyond. So I'm wondering if they ever had any interaction. I don't think any of us know that, but it would be interesting to figure that out.
It would be, yeah. I'll have to look into it.
Yeah.
And then, you know, he really had a career as a fine artist, as a painter. In 1972, he was included in an exhibition in Pittsburgh called the Fresh Air School. It was a major exhibition with work by Sam Francis, Joan Mitchell, and Ting. And this is a biography he wrote for the catalog, which I think tells the story of his trajectory moving from Shanghai all the way to Paris to New York.
Yeah.
These are examples of some of the works that were shown in the Fresh Air School exhibition. Eric has an interesting connection to them.
I sold the one on the left, at least, for the Carnegie Museum of Art to add to their acquisition fund, in that they had several Ting paintings from this exhibition that they acquired at the time. So they decided to sell a few in order to raise funds to buy other works of art.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is a photo of Sam Francis, wow, Joan Mitchell, and Ting at the opening of that exhibition, which I think is really wonderful. And it also demonstrates that, you know, many of these artists who were part of the 1 Cent Life portfolio remained friends for the rest of their lives. Really something special, and speaks to the power of collaboration. I mean, it was really a major collaborative and community effort to bring this group of artists together to create One Cent Life. These are examples of kind of the paintings that he became known for in the 70s and 80s, these really bright images of animals and women and flowers and birds and cats. It's one of my favorite. And then ending on the note that these are the first sneak peeks that anyone has seen of the exhibition. We will be wrapping up the installation tomorrow, but to kind of just give you an idea of what to expect when you get to the museum. Again, we look forward to welcoming you on September 25th. The exhibition will run all the way through January 3rd, so you have a few months to come and visit it. And now we have some time for some questions.
Great.
Bob?
And we don't have any questions that were not already asked, except I saw Helvetica in One Cent Life. Do you know what fonts were used?
Oh, interesting.
That's an interesting question in the book.
We have not managed to identify the specific font that was used for, as you see here, for the title. Our graphic designer actually had to trace and recreate the font to be able to use it in the exhibition because we couldn't identify it.
Okay. So did he ever travel much throughout the world after arriving in New York?
He traveled a little bit. He returned for exhibitions in Copenhagen in the early 60s. He did go back for the exhibitions. He continued to show at the salons in Paris through 1968, and he would often travel back for the openings of those exhibitions. In the 1980s, his wife passed away and he was left with two small children. They lived in Greenwich Village together for a while before he decided to relocate them to Amsterdam, where he spent the majority of the rest of his life. They're often traveling back between New York and Amsterdam. He did keep a studio in New York and sadly suffered a stroke towards the end of his life and ended up passing away in New York City.
And how did you find a list of travelers for the trip?
Oh, for the, this is really silly, on Ancestry.com.
Wow.
Be a walking advertisement.
Okay.
Very good.
I also found his immigration papers and a lot of other fun documents.
Oh.
His marriage certificate.
Did he travel much throughout the world after arriving in New York?
Well, yeah, I think we answered that. Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Do we know any response to the work back in Shanghai? Has it been shown? I assume it's been shown, or at least there's been some activity. Do we know anything about the response or the reception?
It has had some reception. Really, he's been mostly ignored for the past few decades. He did have a kind of survey exhibition in Taipei a few years ago, mainly of his later work. What I think is really interesting about Ting is that oftentimes when people talk about the One Cent Life portfolio, so much emphasis is placed on Sam Francis, who did act as the editor of the portfolio, but from what I've gathered, he really lent his name to it so that the portfolio would have the name recognition that Ting desired, because Francis was so famous then. And according to Ting, Francis also paid for the paper.
And he had a lot of money, so yeah, that would be why.
He was very wealthy. But I think no one has really looked closely at his older work, going all the way back to the 1950s in Paris. And to me, it's really fascinating to try to find information about that, because he was well known in the 50s and 60s. He was showing, he was getting major reviews in art periodicals. And then that kind of tapered off in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. And he's mostly been written out of art history completely.
Yeah, and it's time to write him back in. So a retrospective here in the West and in Europe is long overdue, and there's more than enough wonderful material to make a really, really important exhibition happen. So hopefully one day we'll see that.
We have a question. How did you find the list of travelers on the trip? I'd like to find one for the SS America 1956. My mom came over in 1956. Wonderful presentation by both of you. Agreed.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. That's very nice.
Did you get all of that on Ancestry?
I did. I found the passenger list on there. There are also various places that you can search for immigration papers. I love, particularly for European artists or artists who were working in Europe, trying to locate passenger lists, because you can trace when they were traveling and where they were going and maybe who they were interacting with or who they were traveling with even, because you may see a name on the passenger list that kind of leads you down a rabbit hole. Because I really love diving into kind of the lived experiences of these artists, who they were, what they were doing on a daily basis. To me, then you really get to the heart of who these people were and why they were creating art. And I was able to do that a little bit with Ting, but there really aren't a lot of biographical records for him going back that far. And he used about 6 different names from what I've gathered. So
exactly. I think Ellis Island also has a really wonderful database that you can go and search for family records.
Yeah. But remember, one thing about Ting, he showed up on a tourist visa and he just never left. He did not become a citizen of the United States until 1972.
Oh, really? Wow. So he was illegal for that long?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Okay, one more question. What do you each view as the most fascinating or surprising thing about Ting you've learned during your research over the years?
Ooh.
Each of you.
Interesting.
It is.
I think I was surprised to learn. I didn't know a lot about Ting before I started working on this exhibition. And I think the big surprise for me was the fact that he had created all of these other artist books that were very similar to One Cent Life. That was a big surprise to me. And I kept finding more of them, both before One Cent Life and after. And I truly love the medium of artist books and of print portfolios. So it was really exciting to me to find this 20th century artist who was working in such an experimental way with what was at the time a very new medium. So I think I would have to say discovering, the early artist books and Chinese Moonlight and Hot and Sour Soup, that was a big surprise for me because I had never seen them before.
And I think for me, it has a lot to do with his years in Hong Kong, because that was just part of his biography that I was never aware of. I knew about Shanghai, I knew about Paris, and I knew about New York, but I didn't know so much about Hong Kong, and always wondered, like, where did he become at least somewhat proficient in English, even though he was never fully proficient. But of course, Hong Kong would have been a British territory at the time. English would have been the dominant language, or at least one of the dominant languages. And just thinking about how Hong Kong for so many became a launch pad to a broader, more international life. So that put a lot of the pieces of the puzzle together for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's our questions for tonight, Anastasia. So
no more burning questions from anyone?
Nothing burning on. So.
Well, as always, anyone can always reach out to me. My email is on the website. We are going to have some really fun kind of digital resources about One Cent Life. We're going to have a page about it on our recently launched Google Arts and Culture page, which I encourage you to visit. And we're going to align some of our virtual programs with One Cent Life. Our Music in the Museum group will be playing music from the 1960s in conjunction with the exhibition later in this fall. So I encourage you to visit our website and follow us on our social media channels to kind of keep up to date with some of the exciting events we have in store for you this fall.